Friday, long weekend, and we got a double dose of podcasting this week.
Oh yeah, yeah. That was super fun last night to talk to you
Yeah.
about.
Uh,
I really did enjoy that. It's so funny. Marie came home from swimming, and I was like, "Hey, we should listen to my podcast." She's like, I hear you talk all the time." I'm like, "No, this one was really good.
yeah.
It got kind of deep and emotional." And
Yeah.
she's like, I know everything there is to know about you.
Right.
That's what she said. I'm like, "Okay, so you're not gonna listen?" She's like, "No, maybe sometime." So she's on.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we don't have that one on audio only, so you can listen to it in your car. Well, I guess you could listen to the YouTube video while you're driving.
Good.
So.
Yeah, you could. Oh
Oh, I
goodness. So
love
yeah,
it.
it's Friday, long weekend, and we're at an interesting point, right? We're kind of in this transition time as far as weather.
Yeah. Weather is
Like
beautiful this right
70,
now. Mm,
70 degrees on Sunday, they said.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I mean, for our international people, sorry, we're living in the desert, and so
Yep.
we get an earlier spring than most. I'm out of my sling, so
Yay. That's good.
that's good. I'm still, I think, 4 weeks away from swimming, but getting there. So yeah, good things are happening. So today we're going to talk about what we can do from this point to looking to our first race and some kind of good things to start to think about doing now,
Mhm.
so you can have a successful first race of the season. Particularly, I guess if you live in the Southwest, right, where we're going to start racing here. I mean, the Havasu Triathlon is coming up soon.
Yeah.
Um, I think it's less than a month away.
Yeah, we just had
Um,
Jerry, one of our members, just posted he's going down to it.
yeah,
So when is that? That's let me look
and the
real quick.
UNLV Tri Club, they're going to go down. And then if you were super crazy, I think Triton Man is this weekend in San
Yep.
Diego.
Mm-hmm.
So racing starting, and and John, most of the people that we know and that we most people in the Tri Club, they're looking at an April race, either like
Mm-hmm.
something local like Rage,
Mm-hmm.
our club event, or Oceanside,
Oceanside. Mm-hmm.
George as their first race, and that's pretty typical for people
Mm-hmm.
in our area. So as we look to this time, people are kind of getting away from like their base training and starting to think more about, okay, I'm shooting for this particular race.
Mm-hmm.
So John, what do you start to think about as far as your training at this time of the year?
Well, it is interesting signing up for an early spring race. The early spring race does sneak up on us.
Yeah.
And even though right now it's turning into some beautiful weather, and even got the Jackpot Ultra going on this weekend, leading up to this, it's sort of gray days, or we've had some rain, and you're indoors more. For us, it's a tough winter when it's below 40 degrees.
Right.
But even so, these spring races just have a way of sneaking up. So really, fortunately, having done this a few times, a few years, you know that in January, that's really where the beginning of the work begins, as you talked about, trying to establish your base. And you try to pull out your crystal ball in January and say, this is what I need to do, even though it's winter, and to get ready for late February and early March, so you can incorporate some type of taper for some type of race that would be happening near the end of March or early April. And so at this point, we're where are we? We're mid March, right, or mid February
Yep.
right now. So my first race is right at the end of March. So I'm really about 4 or 5 weeks out, and I'm trying to really put in the big work right now, this week and next week, so that I can do a nice taper going into that event. And that taper will be 2 weeks, a little bit of a third week as well. But I'm still even trying to build through that first race, because the triathlon season here in Las Vegas and the Southwest is long. It's a long season. So if you can sort of top off the training in the beginning, then you can sort of manage the rest of the year a little easier, I find. So I'm right now trying to put in some peak volume for a 70.3 type of race, and looking forward to this week and next week, and then I'll start backing off.
So when you're starting to add volume at this time, what's the physiologic thing your physiologic goal?
So Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm going to use the word durability in the run. I do feel like I need to build that up, whether that's a physiological term or biomechanical term, whichever way. But I am trying to really focus on building up some run time. And mostly right now, I am trying to run on the road. But leading up until this time, I also have done a lot of work in the water, where it's body weight support and less shock to the body, less demand on the body to run in the water, but yet you can still get a training response. So physiologically with volume, I'm really just trying to put the time in to build up that aerobic base so that I can be as economical as possible, just talking physiology, when I'm swimming, biking, and running, and that I'm not having to redline it really much at all.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, right? Because I think you're doing exactly what I would be doing
Mhm.
is that at this time, and for the people I'm coaching, this is what we're doing. We're building volume right now,
Yeah.
and we're building volume, not just volume to do a 70.3, but like to build volume to increase their aerobic capacity
Mhm.
and aerobic efficiency. I don't know which one is which, but and it's sometimes it's a challenge, right? Like when I put a 4 hour bike ride in or a 5 hour bike ride, and someone's like, well, I'm only doing a 70.3,
Mhm.
and the bike ride is going to be 3 hours or 2.5 or 3 hours. Why am I doing 4 and 5 hour bike rides? It's to build that, right? And you
Mhm.
mentioned durability, and part of it is if you can get off the bike at 3 hours, normally you're getting off the bike at 4.5 hours, and now you can run because you're used to going longer.
Yeah.
I've kind of always had this in my mind that I think that the longest bike ride you should do for a 70.3 should be the time of your total 70.3.
Yeah, I like that rule. You've talked about that before, and that's a really good rule of thumb to follow.
Yeah. And I remember the first 70.3 I ever did. I was just so excited. I did a 56-mile bike ride before,
Yeah, right,
right?
right.
And the run was such a struggle, right? Because
Hmm.
that was my limit,
Yeah.
and now I got to run 13.1 miles, and I'd been running, and
Hmm.
I'd ran up to 13 miles because I'm like, okay, I got to be able to run 13 miles. But I never extended past that 56 or the time.
Hmm.
And when I started putting that into practice, my runs just got better and better, you
Hmm.
know. And so the run durability came from the bike durability.
Yeah.
I was just so much fresher getting off the bike
Hmm.
and purposely not riding at my limit,
Hmm.
as we've talked about before. So I think this is a good time to do that. Now, the natural inclination of a lot of people this time is to try and put in more intensity.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I just think it's a mistake right now
Hmm.
to do that. I think keep the intensity you've been doing through the off season, and then add volume.
Hmm.
Right? You don't need that much intensity, and the research is kind of cool on this stuff too. And I know you've read this as well. You really only need 2 or 3 weeks
Yeah.
to get that neurologic system
Yeah.
kind of turned over,
Hmm.
if you even need it, right? Like as
Yeah.
far as for a 70.3, do you need that fast turnover?
Hmm.
Maybe if you're going to run, like if you're running 6 minute miles, okay, yeah, you might need that. But if you're running 9 minute miles, I don't know if you really need that risk, uh, the risky running to at that time. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. I mean, the more intensity that you incorporate, the more risk of injury you're going to have, especially with running. With swimming, probably get away with some of it. With biking, you can also get away with some intensity because of non-weight bearing nature, but running intensity is going to be the part that you're really running a risk. I think it's also just important, and you and I both do this, and I know you're really good at doing course recon. And there are times that you look at a course and say, well, you know what, I've got to be ready for this part of the
Yeah,
course, whatever this part of the course is. People doing Oceanside, we know that the run has some real punchy spots on the course. And they're not long. They're just, short bursts uphill, short bursts downhill. But I do, and I think that there's some benefit to practicing those, but more so for a mindset of how to run quickly up a 30-yard uphill or, downhill. and just understand what your technique is going to be like so that you can get back into your pace once you're up that hill or once you're down the hill. So that, and, in the research you mentioned that, really the high intensity work works when you use it only a little bit. It doesn't take much as a stimulus when it's a high intensity. The tendency for people to do is to say, well, if a little bit of intensity is good, a lot more intensity will be good. And that's not the case. I mean, you can work in, really short bursts of running, just a couple, and that's probably adequate for a training for a 70.3. You can work in some short bursts on the bike, and really that's going to be adequate. You don't need a lot of high intensity to get that training stimulus.
Because this is all aerobic.
Yeah, right,
We've
right. And that's the balance, right?
this all so many times.
Yeah.
It makes me think of like, I'm doing the Zwift Racing League again,
Hmm.
and it's awesome. Like this week we had a course that had three, let's call it 2-minute climbs in it.
Hmm.
It was just about a 40-minute race. But those three 2-minute climbs, I was all in.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
it is like zone 7 stuff, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Heart rate maxed,
Right.
and I could feel the next day,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
the
Right.
neurologic stress I was under, even
Hmm.
for three 2-minute efforts,
Hmm.
right? But when it's all out, your body can't take, it doesn't need to take much more, and you don't need
Right.
much.
Hmm.
And then I rode today, and I was still feeling that, but I was feeling good because of it. Like I was like, okay, I'm got a little bit more pep in my step from like just once again 6 minutes worth of effort. It doesn't need to
Oh,
be,
right.
you know 10 by 4 minute
No.
effort
Mm-mm.
for what we're trying to do. Once again,
Hmm.
like I think if you're doing super sprint or you're trying to once again be an ITU racer, like at that level, yeah, you
Yeah.
probably need to do that stuff when you're running 5-minute miles or faster.
Hmm.
So they're running
Yeah.
430 miles off the bike.
Hmm.
But for 70.3 racers, especially age groupers, I think that once again, less is better.
Hmm.
But it's so hard to convince people, John. Oh my gosh, because
Oh, yeah.
you don't have to
No.
convince people, right? Because you're not coaching people. I'm coaching people,
Yeah.
and they always, oh, I think I should be doing more intensity.
Yeah, yeah, right, right.
You should be doing more volume.
It's minimum effective dose is what you got to keep coming toward back towards. And yeah, no, you're very good at coaching people to focus in on the frequency and the volume and working the intensity where you can, but that's that's what you got to balance is the risk benefit of doing high intensity work.
It's really hard too when you're an age group triathlete and you have limited hours,
Hmm.
right? You and I are so lucky. Our jobs are like
Yeah.
we can. I can work till 10 o'clock at night if I want, right?
Hmm.
Reading papers, whatever.
Yep.
Some people don't have that, and they only have, let's say, 10 hours a week to train.
Hmm.
And I think oftentimes they, because of that, I got to go hard.
Yeah.
And once again, I don't think you have to.
Hmm.
And I get like, oh, yeah, you'll have potentially thinking about, well, I have more time to recover between sessions, but do you when you're busy all of the
Right.
time?
Hmm.
So, and we've talked about this, just a couple of weeks ago, like that physiologic or
Yeah.
the stress,
The
psychological,
mental. Yeah.
physiologic stress. And so I even say like those people are doing only 10 hours a week or less,
Hmm.
this still should be a majority of it to be aerobic. And
Hmm.
and we also talked a lot about this too, like where can you gain a little bit more aerobic, right? Like
Yeah.
walking upstairs, like at
Right.
your office, and getting out of your chair and just walking around, like taking a
Hmm.
10-minute break and just walking, right? That can be a little bit of an aerobic stimulus for you. And so I think we run into that sometimes.
Oh, totally. And so right now, I think you're talking about taking your athletes, you're building volume at this point of the year, and then you're going to start backing off. Some people, their first race, it may not be the main race that they're looking at as, their A race, if we want to call it that. And maybe that race they're going to train through, and that's fine. But it is something that if you do have your first race and you are targeting that as one of your key races, this is the time to have your volume and so you have a little bit of time to back off and do some type of taper. How long do you do your taper now?
It depends, right?
Hmm.
It actually it depends on the training load. right? So
Mm.
some people, they may get a very, like I work with, a very short taper because
Yeah.
for some reason or another, their training load hasn't been high enough.
Mm-hmm.
And if it hasn't been, well, then I just need to get them fresh. Like it could be 3 or 4 days.
Yeah.
Let's hypothetically say this, and by the way, this stuff happens. Hey, I've got a work conference this week. I can't
Mm-hmm.
train.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The week, the week I would normally be, 2 weeks out or 3 weeks out, where normally have a high volume week.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then we can't really from there taper. So it might be okay. Well, you're going to come back. You're going to feel good. We're going to give you another week of stimulus and then a 1 week taper.
Mm-hmm.
So it really is individual. I don't think there's a right answer. If I had, in the perfect world, and I had an athlete that's okay, like you're going to do the optimal training
Mm-hmm.
for 70.3, I'd probably say 12 days
Mm-hmm.
of taper. For an Ironman, maybe 3 weeks.
Yeah.
If we could say, hey, optimal, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
hit every metric, and you were doing your 100-mile bike rides and your
Mm-hmm.
20-mile runs, whatever the case may be for your full Ironman. Yeah, I think like that's the and that's the thought process that needs to occur. Like for me as a coach, it has to occur, and for an individual athlete, just because the books say, oh, you need a 2 week taper. Well, it's really dependent on how much volume you've had in the last probably
Mm-hmm.
6 weeks going into
Yeah.
that.
Right. Yeah, and I love that period because you're really trying to minimize your risk of injury during that phase. Not do anything that's going to tip the scales in the wrong direction. How about training wise, getting ready for race? Because a lot of training programs will say race specific
Yeah. Well, I have
phase.
race specific on my stuff.
Okay, so what types of things do you do in that phase?
Yep. So in race specific, you have to think of like the race, right? And what you're going to do. Um, so for swimming, for example, like I extend the swims to like, okay, if you're going to do a 1.2 mile swim, maybe we do 750s at race pace,
Mm-hmm.
or just maybe even just below race pace. And the bike, I would never say, hey, ride 56 miles. Sorry, we're speaking about 70.3s, but I'd never say do 56 miles at race pace. But I
Mm-hmm.
might say, hey, I want you to do like an aerobic base, and then we'll do like 3 by 40 minutes at your race pace,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you get used to that feeling of what that feels like, because most of the year I'm not touching anything near race pace.
Right.
Right? I'm either above it with my interval stuff, or I'm way below it with my aerobic. So
Mm-hmm.
someone needs to get that feeling of like, what does it feel like to ride? Let's say it's at 200 watts. What does it feel
Yeah.
like to ride at 200 watts for an
Mm-hmm.
extended period of time? And then on the run, exact same thing. It's, whatever we think you're going to race at that speed broken down. So it might
Mm-hmm.
be, I'll give you an example, like 8 by 1,000 meters, or 8 by whatever, 5 minutes at
Mm-hmm.
whatever that race pace is. So if you're going to run 8-minute miles, it'd be at that. But I wouldn't have them do it just straight.
Right.
If I want, because it's faster than a tempo run,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I want to break it down, give them breaks in between where they're going to walk for a minute or 2 minutes in between each one, or even maybe longer, maybe 3 or 4 minutes in between. So
Yeah.
once again, we're all about mitigating the risk of injury,
Yeah.
and I'm so hypersensitive to that. When you start coaching people, you feel this responsibility to get them to the start line fresh and not injured. And I've been pretty successful with that, but it's hard. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and people do get injured. Like that's part of like when we have a conversation, when I start working with an athlete, you're gonna get injured. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's triathlon. Like, well, you might not get injured, but then you're not gonna win. Right? Because no, it's true. Like
Yeah.
it's risk and reward. Like sometimes you have to take a risk,
Right.
right? And that risk is a little bit too much training intensity, maybe a little bit too much volume. You
Mm-hmm.
kind of roll the dice, because it's like my goal is to get on the podium at St. George. Okay, well, based off of where we are today, we may have to take some risks to get there.
Mm-hmm.
As
Mm-hmm.
long as the athlete understands
Yeah.
those risks. But back to your original question,
Yeah.
that's how I incorporate race specific, but you don't need much of it. Like it's 3-4 weeks.
Right.
It's you don't have to do you don't do a lot. And then when I say 3-4 weeks, it's like in the week it might be one run session one bike session like that. It's
Yeah.
not like we're doing 3 or 4 weeks of this 3 times
Hmm.
a week, 4 times a week. So if the total might only be 3 or 4 times.
I love it. Well, what's interesting is thinking personally on my side, if I'm getting ready for a 70.3, my race specific training is a little easier, if you will, than if I'm trying to get ready for a sprint race. In a sprint race, I definitely want to know what it's like to do a fast run
Yeah.
or a component of a fast run. And so I try to retrain my brain to what it's like to run whatever pace I want to actually try to hit. And I mean, obviously, we're doing that for the 70.3 too, but a lot of times you start off at that pace and you're like, this is going to be way too easy.
Yeah.
And I want to go faster, but it's hard to pull the reins back and hold. And the challenge of race specific training for 7.3 is practicing running slower than you think you can run. Whereas
Mhm.
we're getting ready for a sprint, that's where I do try to make sure to get a few short sessions in, getting that race pace or faster, just to get things sort of turning again in terms of what it's going to be like to run at that pace where you are trying to redline. And same thing on the bike. For a sprint, I do like to for race just to get ready for some high intensity and what it's like to hold this wattage and what's that pain going to feel like that you're going to be trying to manage as you go along. But for 70.3, how do I pace this out?
Yep.
So it becomes a
What does
very
it feel like?
different.
What's it?
Exactly. That's right. Right. How do I have patience to be able to bike at this pace for a long period of time? And building that patience up is the key to me for that 70.3. Whereas for a sprint, I actually want to get to that red line and figure out where that red line is for that year.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And so, for example, for a sprint, if it was running, I might say, okay, we're going to do like 400s.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we're going to run 400 at your race
Love
pace,
it. Yeah.
or what we're hoping your race pace to be.
Right.
And then you might actually end up walking a 400, and we'll
Hmm.
another 400 and walk a 400. So this would be on the track or on a treadmill.
Hmm.
It might be minutes, right? You
Right.
do a minute at that pace.
Hmm.
Once again, it's like, how does it feel? Like, what does that actually feel like to move
Yeah.
your legs like that?
Hmm.
And is this sustainable?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I don't know. I know there's some coaches that would say, hey, you need to do like 20 minutes at that if it's a sprint. I'm
Yeah.
like, hey, like you can,
Hmm.
but once again, it's risk reward.
Right.
And with a younger athlete, I might be more willing to do the longer, faster runs, right?
Hmm.
Because we do know that younger athletes tend to be more resilient,
Yeah.
tend to bounce back quicker, and so you have to think about that as well, like the athlete you're working with, and looking at, and this gets deep, but like looking at their injury history as well.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
if someone comes to me like I am 50 years old and I literally have never been injured, and I've done a ton of intensity stuff. Okay, it's a different story.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so yeah, in every like I know on the podcast often we talk about, hey, this is what we think is the best practice for this, but everyone's an individual and everyone's got their story.
Hmm. No, that's spot on.
So John, let's talk about bricks.
Yeah, yeah, that's the other race specific training session. Tell me about what you've been thinking
Well, I
about
want to know
bricks.
what you do first, actually, on this. What's your well? Because I know a little bit what you do, but tell everyone what your brick training is.
Well, I actually don't really do bricks per se, other than maybe one day a week on my Sunday ride. I do a long ride on Sunday. I get off the bike and I'll change into my run gear and then I'll go for a run. And I don't do it, transitioning like you would in a race. I take my time. I get, maybe I go in, rinse down, maybe put on some new sunscreen, something like that. So it's a casual brick, if you will, and but then I do practice running off the bike that way. Uh, Now I have other sessions in the week where I might bike, and then just because of my schedule, I have to get out and run right afterwards. But
Yeah.
I don't know, I know this is weird, but I don't call that a brick other than, well, I guess it's a bike and now it's a run. But sometimes it just, my schedule sort of forces me to cram some things in and I work it that way. But
What do
specific
you call
breaks,
it? The bike is just a warm up for your run.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. But
Yeah.
specific brick training, it's my long Sunday ride, and then I do usually something like a 2 mile run afterwards.
So, I've been going back and forth on bricks,
Hmm.
and you know, I still think they're really risky.
Yeah, they are.
It's once again, it's running fatigued,
Hmm.
and I think that that's where injury is most likely to happen.
Yeah.
Is and John, I hate to say this, especially after the long ride.
Hmm.
Like, if I was advising you, I'd say, hey, do that 2 miles, but do it after your hour ride rather than your
Yeah.
5 hour.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Like I'm like, just because of that, right? Like, I just don't like I can tell you, like, the last time I trained for an Ironman and I started to kind of fall apart in my training,
Hmm.
I think it was the brick running that I was doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was crazy stuff. Like, I'd ride Mount Charleston like all the way to like Lee Canyon and back, like
Hmm.
5 hours, 8,000 feet of climbing, and then run a 5K.
Yeah. And see, I don't even do that. I mean, I do a 2 mile. I mean, that's pretty much the longest run I do after a long ride because like you, I am worried about injury in that phase. And that's why I don't do a 4 mile run. I don't do a 5 mile run. And some people do that. I really keep that post run pretty short.
And I used to do a lot more of them.
Yeah.
Like, I used to do almost every Sunday ride. I had a brick, like,
Hmm.
and I didn't notice any difference.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So, and this is something we talked about a little bit off the air. Is I went into the literature today
Hmm.
and researched this, and actually, is there any research that shows that doing brick training makes the first kilometer of running more efficient,
Hmm.
faster, biomechanically more sound? And I couldn't find anything in the literature.
Hmm.
And the study hasn't been done. And it'd be a really hard study to do. Maybe, John, when we get our like super secret portable 3D motion capture system,
Yeah.
we could do this at a race, right? Like, just
Right. Right. Right.
everybody that goes by, we could, and I think in the future we're going to be able to actually do stuff like this,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And look at people's efficiency on that
Hmm.
first kilometer running
Yeah.
in a race. That doesn't mean it isn't good, right? Like, just because there's nothing in the literature that says it doesn't mean that it can't be beneficial. But the what I read today was, the proponents of it was like, hey, like, we do know for sure when you get off the bike, your running biomechanics are not as good. Your run economy, which we've talked a lot about on this, is not as good,
Hmm.
and it varies person to person. Some
Hmm.
people, it's as short as 200 meters.
Yeah.
Some people, it could be up to a kilometer.
Hmm.
But what one thing I can't find is that person that it takes a kilometer, can they train it to be less?
How to change that? Yeah,
Change
because
that.
what's interesting is there's a lot of research on biking before run.
Yeah.
There's a lot of it, and a lot of different iterations of experiments. Bike at this cadence or this cadence or this power, what have you, and then looking at what happens on the run. And that literature, there's quite a bit in. But the point that you really make here is the gap in the literature is what can you do training wise that influences that bike to run transition. And there's also the swim to bike transition, but I think right now we're zeroing in on this bike run, and there's less work on swim run or swim bike transition. But what are the different ways to train to get into your pace quicker off the bike that you can sustain? And that's the gap in literature that you I think you're spot on that you've hit. That's a tough experiment to actually contrive and then even follow through on in terms of a training program that would improve your bike to run transition.
I'm going to add one more piece, and this is one that is not in the literature, but and probably because the literature is on, almost all of it is on high end triathletes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So one of my biggest problems with people that I work with is they run too fast the first kilometer.
Mm-hmm. Guilty.
Right?
I'm
So
guilty.
do I want to make you more efficient and more biomechanically perfect running
Yeah,
off of it when you're already running too fast?
that's right.
right? Maybe you need the jelly legs to
Yeah,
keep
that's
you
right.
slow. And I'm guilty of it
Yeah.
too. I look down at my watch and oh my gosh, I am not running this fast today, right? That first kilometer hits, and I'm
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
whoa,
Yeah.
you need to like I know you feel good now, buddy, but you got
Well,
21 more of these to go. And like that's been my experience more than
yeah.
anything, running too fast.
That,
So
that's a
could the brick training be to teach you to run slower?
I love it. I mean, this is such an important part because you're right. Most of the literature that I was even thinking about and talking about is how to run better and faster off the
Right.
bike. But that may not be the key. The key may be, especially for the longer races, is to how to not run fast in the
Yeah.
beginning, as opposed to have this tendency to jump off the bike and get into a pace that you sort of are, entrained to and do. So no, I love that point. That's an excellent point.
So that's gonna be my thing with the brick training I'm gonna assign
Yeah,
people. Is like, okay,
yeah,
you got to get off and actually run slow,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Right, right.
right? And I think they'll be happy,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Because I think historically we've always been thinking about, well, how can I get
Yeah,
off efficiently and run fast? And so let's actually talk about the swim bike brick.
yeah.
Okay. So I actually started using this with one athlete last year
Hmm.
because he was feeling that his first like 5 minutes on the bike, he was just couldn't put out the power that
Okay.
he could after 5 minutes.
All right.
And so fortunately, he was doing a lot of obviously swimming at the gym. But
Hmm.
his gym had a cycle studio. It was, your typical gym that's got a swimming and cycling. And so what we did with him is he'd swim and then obviously have to change. I'm like,
Hmm.
don't like, but go directly to the bike.
Right.
And then he would do 10 minutes at whatever race we wanted to do that pace,
Love it.
or just even a little bit above that pace.
Hmm.
And we did this for about 6 weeks or so. He didn't do it every time, but it was like once or twice a week he would do it. And it was a pain. He told me it was a pain to have to do it, right?
Yeah.
Because like, you get finish your swim and you got to get to work, you got to,
Hmm.
whatever you got to do.
Yeah.
But it actually did make a difference for him. But
Hmm.
it was a very specific case where we were actually looking at his power numbers. And once again, many people put in too much power in the first 5 minutes on the bike,
Hmm.
10
Hmm.
minutes. But he just wasn't able to generate. Now, he was, I mean, he had an FTP over of 330 watts.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Hmm.
Right. But, and so the plan was, he was doing Olympic racing, was to race at, 200 or 320 watts.
Hmm.
And he was only able to put out like 280, 290 until 5 minutes or so. And then he got into it.
Interesting.
So it was a very specific case.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like once again, a lot of people I coach, they do 70.3s, and I'm like, okay, on that first 5 minutes of the bike, don't go crazy.
Right.
Like, but it's I think there's a place for that transition training
Oh,
of that.
I think you're spot on with that because you're going from a horizontal position in the water to then on the bike in a crunched up position in Earl. And that's not an easy posture transition from going from swimming to biking. And so I think practicing that, I've always wanted to do this. I just haven't gotten into it, do a long swim and then jump on the bike and go. But I just have not, I just haven't worked that in. But I do think that the important part of swimming and even my swim training is I'm not trying to swim train to go faster in swimming. Yeah, that's nice. That's a nice sort of tangent of doing the swimming. But really, I'm swimming to be able to bike better. And I remember when I got back into triathlon, and that's my second phase of my triathlon career. I remember getting out of the water, and I was not swim fit, and that really influenced my bike quite a bit. And at that point, I'm like, I actually need to get more fit just to be able to do the same time, but it's not as taxing. And then I can get on the bike and then push what I want to for that race.
Yeah, and it's so difficult, right? Like with so many of the triathletes that we know, swimming is a big. It's difficult. It's really,
Yeah,
and it's a struggle. Like
right.
it's I'd say for 75% of the triathletes I know, the swim is the most
Hmm.
anxiety,
Yeah.
and it's like the most difficult part for them.
Hmm.
And if they're having to put out so much energy,
Right.
like to get through that, it absolutely, when we talked about this before, I mean, it's going to definitely affect that,
Hmm.
and it may actually affect that first 15 minutes on the run on the bike, or even longer on the
Yeah,
bike,
very much so. Right.
especially. And we've talked energy systems on here before, especially if they're glycolytic in the water.
Hmm.
Right?
Hmm.
So they're not like kind of this chill fat burning mode that you probably are,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
they're actually glycolytic, and so they're going to get off or get onto the bike in a different energy availability than
Yeah.
you are.
Right.
And I've seen this happen to me many times where I get on the bike and I look down and I'm like, oh my gosh, my heart rate's like 160.
Yeah. Right. Right.
First time I
Right.
looked at it, 'cause you can't look at it in the water.
Yeah.
Right?
Hmm.
I'm not looking at it in the transition zone.
Mm-mm.
There's too much going on. I'm like, so how long was my heart rate at 160 for?
Yeah.
Like, was it at 160 that whole swim? Like, oh my
Hmm.
gosh, that's
Right.
not good. Like that's, zone 5, right? Like that's,
Mm.
and was I just burning all my fuel? And
Right.
how is that like, and I get deep on this stuff. Like, how does that influence my run
Hmm.
3 hours later?
Yeah. Right.
And is my fueling plan not good enough because I burned, I don't know, 600 calories of carbohydrate or
Yeah.
sugar in the water, and you
Hmm.
didn't because you're a very efficient swimmer and you're not redlined.
Right, right. No, but you're right. I mean, even when I get on the bike, I'm already thinking, okay, where am I nutrition wise? Because now I need to account for what just happened in the swim, but then also start preparing for what's happening on the bike. And that's not always easy. And practicing that fueling plan or having a good fueling plan coming out of the water is really important.
Yeah, but once again, your fueling plan might be different than mine, right? We
Yeah,
do the
that's right.
exact
Right,
same.
right.
And if you're in zone 2 and I'm in zone 4,
Mm-hmm.
in let's say a 5 zone
No,
model,
no.
I utilize a lot more carbohydrates than you did
Mm-hmm.
and I swim longer than you, right? Like
Right.
I'm a slower swimmer, and so
Mm-hmm.
if I'm 10%, 15% slower, and I'm utilizing a different energy source,
It's a
my
different
fuel
game.
will be
Mhm.
different.
Yeah,
And so, we talked about this before, but my fueling plan on the bike is to literally get every gram of carbohydrates I can possibly get in me without
right.
having GI distress.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, and maybe I wouldn't need to do that if I just chill out in the water, but I can't.
Hey, that's the goal. I mean, right now my swim time is my swim time, but I think you're right. I mean, there's a lot of people that can improve their swim time, but actually it can be less physically taxing by doing certain things, learning a better technique, maybe learning how to swim straight, learning to sight really well. And those types of things will yield a less stressful swim and probably a faster time. And then you're able to jump on the bike and have a better bike ride. So there are some, the swim fitness is good, but really there's also some of the swim technique and some of those open water swimming tips that are really important to follow through on.
You're killing me right now because I can't swim for 5 more weeks. Okay, so the next thing we had on the list here of things to talk about tonight was technique focus in all three disciplines. So we're already kind of talking about this one,
Hmm.
right? And I really love what you just said. And something that I've been really trying to think about is the people that I work with and myself is how to become a more efficient swimmer.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like maybe I'll never be faster,
Right.
but how can I utilize less energy?
Hmm.
And so, one of the things I've really been thinking a lot about with triathletes in particular is overkicking.
Hmm.
And once again, I get it. Like if I'm an open water swimmer and I just got to swim, I'm doing an open water swim. It's 1.2 miles. I'm
Right.
gonna kick like crazy,
Right.
right? But I also understand those are the largest muscles in the body, the ones that are going to be once again utilizing energy, utilizing carbohydrates.
Hmm.
Maybe I need to actually kick less,
Yeah. Hmm.
especially in a wetsuit, which a lot
Hmm.
of our races are, but not because it's going to be a faster swim,
Hmm.
but I'm going to utilize less energy. So then I might be 30 seconds slower in the swim and I'll make up 5 minutes on the run later.
Right.
And once again, like I think we become a complete triathlete when we start to think like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Once again, this is swim, bike, run. It's not just how
That's
quick I
right.
can.
Mm-hmm.
And I know swim coaches are like
Mm-hmm.
mad at me for saying like, oh, you should kick less. Like it's really important. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm telling you, when you're kicking hard for 1.2 miles or 2.4
Mm-hmm.
miles, you're utilizing energy that is really not propulsing you very much forward.
No.
So you know the research on this. How much does the kick influence propulsion forward in
No,
swimming?
a number I would throw out would be 10% of the propulsion force. It's not a lot,
And that's
but
a
it
good
is
and
important.
that's a
Yeah,
good
yeah,
swimmer.
that's right. But the important thing, and you're spot on, people should not be practicing the kick specifically unless their kick actually drives them backwards. I know that sounds odd, but your kick technique can actually work against you more so than for you. And so then it's a time to really get a kickboard out, practice the kinking sets, do some different catch up type of drills, and get that kick to where it is not interfering with your stroke. And then the other part with the kick is learning the timing of the kick is more important than even trying to generate a propulsion force. And when I say timing, it has to be coordinated. Your lower body and your upper body have to coordinate together, just like it does in running. When you're running, you just naturally fall into a nice rhythm of upper body movements and lower body movements. In the pool, that rhythm is harder to find. And there's a lot of things that you can do that end up using the wrong rhythm, that your legs and your arms are not being coordinated. And I think that that's one of the keys with especially in triathlon, being a better open water swimming is learning how to coordinate your legs and your arms. And then it doesn't become costly to have a kick that actually helps you move forward because it's not the kick necessarily, it's the coordination with your arms that is actually going to help you move forward.
Yeah. And I'm not saying don't kick.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm
Oh, I
saying
I I
don't
do
kick
to be
big.
kick. Yeah,
Just don't kick big. Like because the
yeah,
kick is for
yeah,
most people, it's timing, like you said.
yeah,
And going back to where we started, it's becoming a more efficient swimmer. Like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
less energy to get from A to B.
Mm-hmm.
Could you go faster? Yeah, but you use
Right,
so much more energy.
right.
Um, and then I love the fact you talked about the coordination. So this is the
Mm-hmm.
other thing. Like, I'm not a big fan of like kickboard kicking
Mm-hmm.
because then there's no coordination.
Yeah.
You're kicking back and forth. There's no timing. And if anything, when people do it, they actually increase their cadence a lot. Like I
Mm-hmm.
see people
Mm-hmm. Sure.
kicking, they're like, and their swim coach is like, hey, you got to do whatever 50-yard kick on
Yeah.
a minute. And so they're like kicking as fast
Mm-hmm.
as they can,
Yeah.
and it would be like a 10 beat kick if they
Mm-hmm.
were actually
Mm-hmm.
you could
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
do it. And the coordination is so important
Mm-hmm.
that I would be like, okay, if you're going to do it, let's get your cadence that you're normally swimming at, and
Right.
let's make sure your kick cadence when we're training it is the same. It's not
Mm-hmm.
faster.
So you're spot on, and I do not advocate kickboard sets, especially for triathletes, except if you do use a kickboard and you start kicking, and I said this almost jokingly, but it's actually real. If you go backwards while you're holding on to a kickboard, your
Yeah,
kick is working against you, and that does require some specific coaching to get that going, and then a
gotta
kickboard
be
is
careful.
helpful, and it can happen. It's actually probably more common than we think that you use a kickboard or you go backwards because a lot of times people's ankle are not flexible enough, or the way that they're kicking, the coordination is just wrong, and you end up creating a backward force. But the other thing I do with swimming is I use fins,
I was just gonna say that.
not to go faster, but you do go faster. What I tell people to use fins for is to pay attention to when your foot is kicking and what your arms are doing. Because when you have the fins on, it's a little easier for your brain to figure out where your lower extremity is. And without the fins on, it's just harder to figure that out. But you put fins on and you've got this big thing on your foot and you can feel, oh, my foot's going down. Okay, well, where's your hand? How are you coordinating that with your upper body? And I think that's where the value of fins really comes in for triathletes is it helps people learn how to coordinate the lower and upper body.
No, I couldn't agree more. I'm a huge proponent of fins.
Yeah.
I swim. I will not go a swim practice without fins for me.
Yeah.
My warm up is always in fins. There's a
Okay.
few reasons for me is like historically, one of my limiters has been cramping while swimming in the
Yeah.
legs.
Yeah.
Well, that's because I was over
Yeah.
kicking.
Right. Right. Right.
I don't need to be kicking so hard. Like
Hmm.
I've got strong hamstrings. I've got strong quads. Like why am I
Yeah.
cramping swimming in races? It's because I'm kicking too dang hard.
Right.
So fins don't allow you to kick hard either, right?
Hmm.
They limit
That's
the
right.
amount of knee flexion that you actually can get.
Right.
So if you
Hmm.
really bend your knees a lot,
Hmm.
especially the fins stop you from doing it because you feel it.
Hmm.
And this is something once again historically runners coming to swimming or cyclists coming to swimming, they have too much knee flexion when they're
Hmm.
and you put fins on them and all of a sudden they don't have it anymore
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
you can kind of retrain that. And
Hmm.
then the second point I was going to make is something you also said about the ankle flexibility.
Hmm.
People will not do ankle flexibility exercises. They're just
Okay.
not going to stretch. Like I hate to tell that. Like I've said, hey, you should do this stretch for ankle flexibility. Oh, okay, and they do it a couple of times.
Hmm.
But fins actually help, right? It's a dynamic
Yeah.
stretch that
Right.
when you're actually doing the motion, that little bit of weight on the end will actually increase your flexibility. So it's
Hmm.
kind of, to me, it's a win-win, swimming in fins. And the other thing is, I'm railing today on swim coaches. Oh, you can't have fins, right? Fins are cheating. I'm like,
Yeah. No, that
but
swim
they put them on
coaches.
for their
Yeah.
kick sets, but like swimming, well, why? Because I'm going 10% faster? Who
Hmm.
cares? I don't care how fast I go in practice.
Yeah.
Here on when I'm lined up at a race, that's when I want to go fast. And I'm doing
Hmm.
things to make me faster then. And I'm
Yeah.
not cheating by wearing fins in the pool.
Right. No, I love it, and there's a lot of coaches that I know and follow that they like the speed assistive devices because you do have to learn what it feels like to go. We've talked about this with running. I mean, you've got to learn how it feels to go fast and how your body rotates at different velocities. And so, using speed assisted devices, fins, or sometimes some type of tether system is actually it's a good thing and pretty. It can be fun too, and it keeps swimming fun. Uh,
So I want to talk about cycling right now and technique, and
hmm.
especially this time of year.
Yeah.
So a lot of people in the off season are training indoors
Yeah. Right.
and not in aero,
Hmm.
or they're training outdoor, maybe mountain biking, not in aero, road bike.
Hmm.
It's winter. I'm going to be on a road bike. It's more comfortable. So this is the time where you need to be starting to put volume in aero.
Hmm.
And I get it, like especially on the trainer. I hate being in aero on the trainer.
Hmm.
I just, I don't know. Outside I have no problem,
Right.
but at this time of year, you got to start transitioning to it. And one of the things that I tell people is, okay, let's do 10-minute on, 10-minute off, like to kind of get back into that feeling of
Hmm.
being an aero. And this is especially for older athletes that once again might be lacking some flexibility. Is you just can't go into, hey, I've been doing basically no aero, and a couple weeks before I got my race, I'm going to get on my time trial bike and I'm going to get into aero because you're going to hurt yourself.
Hmm.
So how do you do that, John? Like, I know you spend a lot of time in aero anyways, but
Yeah, this was when we came up this topic. This is one of the first things I wrote down is being get practicing in aero position because I'm like you, I'm probably worse than you on a trainer. I hardly ever go into aero position. It just isn't. I just don't, and laziness, whatever it is. But I
I'm
do
the
not
same.
train my aero position on the trainer, and so what I try to do this time of year, getting ready for that first race is getting out on the bike and being in aero position as much as I can, when I'm out on a training ride outdoors. So yeah, I think this is something, uh, yeah, that worries me when I do a lot of training ride indoors is will I be able to transition to the aero position, not only for my back, my neck, even my hamstrings. Things are just operating a little bit differently when you are in aero position, but trying to incorporate that. I try to still do at least one ride a week outside, even through the winter. There were several weeks where that didn't happen. So now I'm trying to get I'm trying to get that outdoor riding technique back out.
And it's hard, like
Hmm.
especially like I said, indoors. Now I got my TV set up
Yeah,
nice,
yeah, yeah,
everything set, my fan set to hit me in the
yep,
face for sitting up. Like it's just effort to do.
yep.
And I have my
Mhm.
time trial bike on my trainer. I still
I,
don't,
me too.
right? And but I can tell you, like when it comes to time to race,
Hmm.
I do it. Like I'll
Okay.
set, you know, I set up a Zwift thing. It'll be just like 10-minute little things.
Mm, that's
Hey,
good.
you're an arrow, and 5 minutes you're not. In 10 minutes you are. And
Uh,
but outdoors it's so much easier because it's like, well, if I'm sitting up, I'm slower. So I want
yeah,
to be an
yeah,
arrow, so I'm
yeah,
faster.
right,
So you're
right.
right. I think outdoors is definitely easier.
Mhm.
But that's the only kind of thing I had as far as technique for biking that I think we need to start thinking about this time. Did you have anything else?
I didn't put anything down for a technique. I just wrote down, especially of training indoors, is getting ready for that first race, is getting outside and getting into that aero position.
The only other thing, well, I guess I was thinking about with this is if your first race is going to be a hot race,
Hmm.
right? Is your first race a hot race?
It's going to be a little warm and humid. Yep.
So not everyone has that, but if your first race is going to be a hot race, is to start thinking about it, like on the bike, even like, can you get into some acclimatization stuff,
Yeah.
right? So
Right. Right.
doing some stuff indoors with your fan off. I
Yep.
mean, that's probably would be just enough, and not fan off the entire time, but maybe an hour with your fan off, where you're
Hmm.
actually like, you're getting that the
Yeah.
heat response that we're looking for. Okay, let's talk about running and running technique at this time.
Yeah.
We talked about like training principles. What do you got for like running technique that
You
you
know,
work
mostly
on?
what I'll do right now is just trying to use different cadences. And I do try to, I'm not even worried about pace. In fact, I may still run the same pace, but I'll try to use a faster cadence, something along that lines to try to work on that cadence that you would see on race day. And then oddly enough, I do pay attention to the turns and walking a bit, especially if I'm going to do a 70.3, there are periods that you got to walk. And then even thinking about, okay, now I'm walking, I want to start running. What am I going to do? And I know that sounds odd, but just having that practice of going from a run to a walk and from a walk to run is important. And then the last thing I'll mention is practicing some running in the shoes I'll wear on race day. So I don't do a lot of running on those shoes because they're expensive and they don't last long. But I do some just to make sure that my brain understands what's on my feet and how do I run in this new pair of shoes.
Yeah, and that was my number one.
Yeah.
Was you got, in my opinion, you have to do it, right?
Hmm.
You may not want to, but you should. And maybe it's like take them to a track, right? So maybe
Hmm.
it's not, it's a little easier on the
Yeah. Good point. I like that.
there's a little bit more cushioning on a track or even on a treadmill,
Hmm. Hmm.
rather than just out on the road. But get in those shoes. The other thing that I do see happening at this time when we're increasing volume is people tend to do less of their like dynamic warm up stuff and
Hmm.
warming up, and
Yeah.
so especially for running, I think that that's critical, that you still make sure you get those things in for running. I do like cadence as well.
Yeah.
I like varying cadence, but I just like faster cadence. Like
Hmm.
I run at 8 minute mile, and can I, if I'm just
Yeah.
plodding along, I look at my watch and it's like, oh, 170.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
happy with
Yeah.
that. And so it's, something I do with some of the athletes I work with is actually we will use the cues. So every half mile or quarter mile, just a beep on their watch to tell
Mm.
them, hey, look at your cadence. And once again, I think that cadence, we've talked about many times, is the most important metric,
Hmm.
to be continue to look at. Um, Course dependent too, right? Like if
Yeah.
you're a really hilly course, like I can remember getting ready for St. George many times. I'm like, okay, like this is a hilly run course. I
Hmm.
got to be able to run efficiently uphill. I got to be able to run efficiently downhill.
Yeah.
I just can't spend all my time running on a track or on a flat treadmill or
Hmm.
just somewhere flat. Fortunately, we live in places where we can find hills and
Yeah.
we can do that. And um, so I think it's really important. Like you were mentioning Oceanside. I never really thought too much about it at Oceanside because it's so short.
Yeah.
Like
Right. Right.
they're over before you know it. Like I would personally do like a specific thing
Hmm.
to prepare for those little punchy climbs. But like St. George for sure, like
Hmm.
you've got to be out running like hilly courses. So I
Yeah.
think that that's also something maybe you hadn't done, especially if you've been indoor training a lot and running on a treadmill relatively flat, or on a track. I think that that's something that we could do.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, and I think you're right. I mean, there's some sections of a course that they're not long enough to prepare for, but I know when I did Oceanside, was it last year? I actually decided to walk down the hill a couple of times because I'm like, I'm just not ready for this. And so rather than run the risk of, coming down around down the hill and not being able to make that turn at the bottom, I think I really slowed
There's that
down for
the
that.
one really steep one.
Yeah, this is yeah.
Do it twice. You only have to go up it once,
Yeah, right, right.
down it twice.
Oh,
And I'm with you too. Like I go so slow on that.
yeah.
You can literally burn out your quadriceps
Yeah,
just by
yeah, totally.
passing
Right.
that. And I'm like, and people fly by me. Like you get some
Yeah.
young kids, they're flying
Mhm.
by you on the way
Yeah.
down.
Those kids.
The amount of training I would probably have to do and to ramp up
Yeah.
to actually be able to run down that hill fast
Yeah.
wouldn't be worth it.
All
So
right,
I'm with
totally.
you on that. Like I think that once and that's course recon and knowing,
Yeah.
uh, planning for it. Like I am going to take my time on this,
Hmm.
like what 30-second downhill,
Right, right.
right? And yeah, but yeah,
I
I think
think,
that's important.
it's the courses that end up on a golf course are the ones that um, I think are important to know that those could be up and down, up and down, up and down. And for me, it's mostly just trying to figure out how do I find my pace when I'm either going uphill or downhill. That's hard because obviously going slower uphill, and then you get some of it back downhill, but not all of it. But how do you find that overall pace that you can sustain? And I think that's the trick with, those types of punchy courses. And Oceanside, yeah, it's not a great example, but getting to the top of the hill, how do I get back into that pace now? Or getting at the bottom, how do I get back into the pace that I want to sustain? So I don't know. That's always the trick.
Yeah, and so I think that once again that's course specific. So for
Hmm.
people that are going to do like our local race, Rage, as their
Yeah.
first race, that's it's rolling hills, right? Like
Right.
so you should be running some rolling hills, and but if you're going down, let's say, I don't know, to race some of these California races that are dead flat,
Yeah. Right. Right.
have to.
Right.
It's not as important. Like I mean, don't get me wrong, I like running hills.
Hmm.
Almost everybody that I do hill work with, they're running really hard up and pretty easy down.
Hmm. Hmm.
If you're trying to like win a 70.3 and it's got some good downhill sections, you got to practice running the downhills
Yeah.
too.
Right. Well, if you're doing Revel Marathon or half marathon, you better practice for that downhill.
So the question for you I had, John, so
Yeah.
St. George in particular has a lot of cambered running. So side
Yep.
camber. Diagonal Street is the worst
Hmm.
run. I hate running on that
Yeah.
road
Right.
because you have to run it twice, and now you have to run it twice in both directions.
Hmm.
Right? So do you practice running on a side hill camber?
I don't practice, but I do
Okay.
because a lot of our roads that we run on or our sidewalks are going to be cambered. And so I think that's a great point that that's something to pay attention to when you are practicing when you have your run routes, especially if you have a loop. If you do a loop, you're probably always running with the camber in one direction.
Yep.
I love running, out and back for that reason. And I run, one direction for the camber, and then I come back on the same side of the street so that I get the same camber, but in a different direction. So I don't purposely, go and say, oh, I'm going to seek out this camber or that, but I think about my run routes purposefully.
Yeah, I agree, and especially if it's going to be a course like that. So Oceanside has basically none.
Yeah, right. Or
It
you can find that flat spot, or
is
or
that
it's not. Yeah. Hmm.
but St. George in particular, it's really bad.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you want to be your best, you got to practice on.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, John, we made it almost an hour, and we didn't even get to gear.
I know
So
we'll have to follow up on this because there's
uh,
some other things that we can do that isn't even training wise that make us comfortable for race week.
yeah, so awesome. Hey, thanks. It was a great podcast tonight.
Yeah. Have a
Another great
great,
night.
great long weekend.
Yeah, you too. Try not to
Yeah,
work too hard.
I know.
Work hard training, but not hard at
That's
work.
right.
Okay,
All right.
awesome.
Hey, good talking. Thanks,
Yeah,
everyone.
we'll talk to you next week. Bye.